Listening Library presents Pete's Dragon, The Lost Years, by Elizabeth Rudnick. Read for you by Alan Sklar.
Prologue. A long time ago. The dragon lifted his head, his nostrils flaring. The wind had shifted and now carried an unfamiliar scent. Swallowing the mouthful of berries he had been chewing, he took a deep breath, trying to place the smell. Was it wolf? No, not enough fur to be one of those mangy creatures. Lynx? Bear? Again, not enough fur. It also carried an unmistakable scent of fear, unusual for a large predator. Snake, maybe. The dragon took a few heavy steps away from the edge of the pond where he had been having his snack in the warm summer sun. No, not a snake. Whatever it was too large to be a snake. As another gust of wind blew through the forest, the dragon began to walk faster. Curiosity was taking over and making him act unnaturally. It was making him venture away from his comfort zone. For the most part, for the length of his long life, he had rarely strayed far from the cave he called home. This was the first time he had done so in at least a dozen years. As the dragon made his way through the thick trees of the forest, he barely noticed the smaller creatures that ducked and hid, fearful of him. The soft, downy fur that covered most of his body waved as he walked, but did not hide the strong muscles underneath. His wings were tucked tight to his sides so that he could move between the trees with more ease, but if he were to spread them, they would have spanned feet. Amidst the other animals of the forest, he struck fear for his size alone. The fact that he was a dragon, and the only one any of the forest creatures had ever seen, simply made him all the more frightening. The unfamiliar smell grew stronger as the dragon headed south. His territory was far away, hidden in the tall, thick safety of the ancient woods. Another brief flicker of worry flowed over him. He knew better than to leave his area. He had stayed safe and hidden for many long years by keeping to himself. Yet the smell was pulling and tugging at him, impossible to ignore, intriguing to him in a way he could not understand. Suddenly, the smell grew more intense than ever. It was now mixed with a smell that was familiar to the creature: fire. Stopping in his tracks, the dragon reared back on his hind legs and lifted his long neck. He knew fire very well. He had seen the effects it had on the forest. It wiped out whole patches of trees. It destroyed lives, nests, and dens. Worse yet, in the dragon's experience, where there was fire, there were usually humans. Humans. That was the unfamiliar smell. It had to be. His head tilted back as he breathed in deeply, and his jaw opened slightly, revealing his sharp, pointy teeth. He cocked his head and focused his listening. He knew that the human had to be very, very close. Sure enough, a moment later he heard the sound of twigs breaking, and then the fire crackled loudly as something fed it fresh fuel for its flames. Then there came an oddly pitched sound. It sounded like nothing the dragon had ever heard before. It wasn't a howl like the wolves that roamed the woods. It wasn't a chirp like the birds who pestered him from the safety of their tree limbs. This noise rose and fell in an odd octave that was at once soothing and irritating. Despite the tingling feeling in the tip of his tail that usually warned him to stay away, the dragon fell back onto all fours. Slowly he pushed his way up to the edge of a tight ring of trees that surrounded a very small clearing. He knew somehow that the sound must be coming from a human. And he was right. As he peered through the trees, he saw the source of the smell and the sound. It was a very small human. He had only seen one or two of them in his long lifetime, and both times it had been from the safety of the air. This was the closest he had ever come to one. The human stood on two legs and had no fur, except on the top of its head. It had a very small nose, thin limbs, and pale skin. A small animal that resembled a wolf sat beside the human, who seemed to be calling to it in its odd language. For a long time the dragon stood on the outskirts of the clearing, his presence unknown to the pale human creature and its animal friend. The dragon had purposefully stood downwind, so as not to draw their attention. It allowed him a chance to observe the human. It spent a very long time talking to the wolf-like animal, and would sometimes throw its hands in the air and jump about on its two thin legs. At one point, the pale-skinned human grabbed a stick from the ground and began to swing it in front of him. At another point, it suddenly plopped down, and the dragon heard a strange loud gurgle come from its midsection. But while strange, the human seemed altogether harmless. And then the dragon's nose began to twitch. The dragon squeezed his eyes shut, trying to stop the inevitable. But his nose just kept twitching, his eyes began to water, the back of his throat began to tickle. And then it happened. He sneezed loudly. Inside the clearing, the human jumped to his feet and turned in the dragon's direction. The dragon and the small human's eyes met. For a moment, young man and dragon stood there, eyes locked. The young man's fearful and a little curious, the dragon's curious and a little fearful. The dragon's heart thudded in his chest, and he could hear the small human's pounding in his. Then the human let out the loudest screech the dragon had ever heard. In response to what he took as a hello, the dragon let out his loudest roar of greeting. The roar was instinctual. He didn't mean to sound frightening. After all, he knew that the human couldn't hurt him. But unfortunately, the human didn't seem to know that the roar was a nice roar. He fell backward and began scrambling towards something propped up against a tree. It looked like a stick, but when the sun caught it, the stick shone unnaturally. While the dragon hadn't had much experience with humans, he knew what the object was. A gun. He had heard them over the years, the loud banging that became a near constant during hunting season, and he knew what the guns were capable of doing, even to the larger beasts of the forest. Instantly, total fear replaced any curiosity, and the dragon began to panic. He didn't want to be near the gun. He wanted to get far away from there, fast. So he did the only thing he could do at a moment like that. He spread his wings, preparing to take flight. But it was a small clearing, and unfortunately the human, while smaller than the dragon, took up much of it. The fire took up the other part.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?